Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar tonight, where we'll be talking about Australia's role in the shark fin trade and what we can do about it. Firstly, I'd like to introduce my co-hosts for this evening. I've got Lawrence Chlebeck from Humane Society International, who's a colleague of mine, and we work closely together on the Shark Champions campaign. We've also got the author of the recently released Shark Fin Trade Report, Karen Winfield from the Environmental Defenders Office, and Karen is their scientific officer and is very experienced in international trade and wildlife trade more specifically. So what we'll do is I'll just now jump into sharing our presentation, and we can explore what tonight's journey is going to look like, the things we'll discuss, and ultimately get to an endpoint where we can present to you a solution that can really address the shark fin trade in Australia, improve the sustainability of our fisheries, improve conservation outcomes, and ultimately the health of our oceans. So if you can just bear with me while I share my screen. One moment. Okay. All right. Excellent. So, sorry, one moment. Here we go. So tonight's journey. First, it's really important that we define what finning actually is, and more specifically, how finning is actually different to the fin trade or trading in fins per se. Next, we'll look at the global fin trade and ask ourselves, is the trade on the up? Where's it currently trending? We'll have a look at the situation in Australia in terms of how we perceive the shark fin trade as Australians, and also our role in terms of how we trade, how much do we trade. We'll then do a bit of a deep dive into the issues in our backyard. So how do Australian laws and how do Australian systems really influence our role in the fin trade and ultimately conservation outcomes for sharks and rays? Then we're going to address what's probably the most controversial question, or the biggest question, and that is, should we just stop trading in fins, full stop? And this will lead us to some solutions. Some you might not necessarily have thought of, but some really nifty solutions that reflect best practice and also what the world's leading science says. And we'll also give you a demonstration, or at least provide you with a resource and an action you can take to have your voice heard and fix Australia's anti-finning laws. You'll see that these are in the comments, and there'll also be a QR code at the end. We'd also like to mention that after that, we'll have an open floor for question time for about 20 to 25 minutes. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible, because I'm sure many people will have some burning questions they just can't wait to get an answer of, and we just can't wait to address them. But time will be short, so if you leave your questions in the comments on the respective Facebook pages of AMCS, Humane Society International, or EDO, we'll get to those questions as soon as we can and as quickly as we can over the course of the next week or so. So we just ask that you bear with us while we address as many questions as possible. But without further ado, let's jump into it and let's have a look at what finning actually is. So finning is actually the practice of cutting the fins off a shark and dumping the body, whether it's alive or dead, overboard at sea. Very different to when someone says the shark fin trade. So when we say, is Australia finning? That's a very different question to saying, is Australia trading in fins? So it's very important we clear that definition up from the start. Finning is the practice of cutting fins off and dumping the body. It's different, so to speak, from the fin trade. And it's the fin trade we're actually going to be looking at. Should also acknowledge that the fin trade is a major driver of overfishing of sharks and rays across the world. And this overfishing is responsible for 36% of all shark and ray species across the world being threatened with extinction. And as we touched on earlier, we do have some issues in our own backyard that help contribute to the threat that sharks face. So I'll now pass it on to Karen. And Karen, where's the fin trade at? Is it on the up?
Thanks, Leo. The current narrative, can you go to the next slide? The current narrative around the world in the last 10 years or so has been that the shark fin trade is declining. And that's been reported across various NGOs in China and Hong Kong related to the consumption of shark fin soup, which has been reported to be down to roughly 80%. That's coincided with reporting of a 50% reduction in dried shark fin imports coming into Hong Kong. Hong Kong historically has been the epicenter of the shark fin trade. So those were sort of the narrative that we were expecting when we started looking at this. There's also a general misconception that the Australian trade is fairly minimal in shark fin, but we'll show later on that it's not as minimal as most people would think. Next slide. So shark fin is primarily tracked across two different mechanisms. The first is to do with HS code, which is utilised by and reported by customs whenever a commodity is traded overseas. The second is through the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and this is based on fisheries data. So that is usually reported by about 86 countries for shark landings. And there are numerous issues around the accuracy of this data, with widespread underreporting reported. And it's also not clear from the data whether countries are reporting live weight, trunked weight, or dressed weight of the shark being landed. So analysing the FAO data takes a lot of work. And the important thing to understand here is that with the HS codes, prior to 2017, we only had one HS code, and that was for dried shark fins. There's also any minced or processed shark fin was used in another HS code, but that was mainly to do with fresh fish. So you couldn't actually tell the difference between a fish or a shark, and there was no way to tell any fidelity between dried, frozen, or fresh shark fins. Next one, please, Leo. So here we can see the global imports for customs trade data. So you can see that there's been a relative drop following 2009, and there's been quite a few years of stable trade up until about 2017, where now we're actually seeing an increasing trade trend. This trade increase is actually coinciding with the new HS codes, and what's actually happening here is it's probably not actually a true increase in trade. What's actually more likely is that trade was already occurring, but you couldn't see it in these other data because all there was dried shark fin. That would have been traded as fresh fish fillets or frozen fish fillets, and you couldn't tell that it was actually shark fin that was being traded. So this is a good thing that we're actually now able to have better traceability of what products and what sharks are actually being traded. But it's probably not an actual proper increase in trade. But what this means is that people doing shark analysis like we are now, we can have a better understanding of what's happening from the trade data, and it better reflects what's happening on the ground. Next slide, please. So when we go across to the export data, there's a slightly different trend happening here. So we have a decreasing trade trend all the way to around 2013. And then from 2014 onwards, we have an increasing trend in trade. Now, same as for the export data, some of that increase in trade is due to the fact that we have new HS codes that is allowing better transparency and better understanding of the shark fin trade. But interestingly, in this data, you'll see that from 2014, 15 and 16 is when that trade trend actually started to increase, and that doesn't coincide with the HS codes that were introduced. So what's happening there? What's the most likely scenario is that unregulated trade that was previously illegal and not being captured has actually been brought into regulation. So countries that are doing better fisheries management are now exporting their shark fins legally instead of illegally. And there's been a lot of work around the world on this. And interestingly, the coinciding of this increase actually coincides with when the CITES listings for various shark species came into effect. So it's very possible that that's what's happening here. Now, both of those trends, having better traceability and better trade and unregulated trade becoming regulated, are both very positive things for sharks. It means that we're better understanding what's happening out there, and the data that decision makers and policymakers and governments are using to make decisions better reflects what's actually happening on the ground. But there is also a possibility of a third reason for the trade increases, and that's that traders are now, instead of going through Hong Kong, they're actually importing directly to their demand markets. So that could be a reason why we're seeing a 50% drop in trade reported in Hong Kong, but overall the trade trend is actually increasing because they're going around the regulations in place. And that's actually quite a bad thing for sharks, because it means that unregulated and unsustainable shark fishing and also possibly finning is occurring, and those fins are making it to market with little or no oversight. So what's the situation in Australia? Larry, can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So as of 2015, which is the latest report on the capture of sharks and rays in global fisheries, Australia ranked at 24th. So that'll be on the next slide, Leo, I believe. So 24th out of all nations in the world, with an average of about 9,000 tons per year caught from about 2000 to 2011. So we're not quite in the top 10 and not quite into the sorts of numbers you see from nations like Indonesia, India, Spain, China, but it's not insignificant. It's still quite a number of sharks. And for decades, Australia was a world leader in shark conservation, especially when it came to trade. Australia was the first nation to nominate a shark, the great white, to CITES, which is an international agreement that regulates the trade in endangered species. But since then, to be honest, we've faltered quite a bit. We've kind of fallen off. We're not taking the lead as we used to in these international meetings to really drive forward international shark conservation. But that doesn't mean we can't get back to where we were. Thankfully, we do have these opportunities to turn it around, first and foremost with the regulation of our own shark fisheries and thereby the shark fin trade to and from Australia. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, so which obviously, because it is happening, opposed to popular belief. We don't trade in fins. It's illegal, says half of all Australians. So this was a poll that Leo and I ran just the other year, attempting to tease out public perceptions of shark finning here in Australia. To really try to tackle this issue, we really had to start from the ground up and really think about what the Australian public knows about shark finning and what they knew about Australia's role in it. You know, and then there's that disconnect. And since half the population wasn't aware of this occurring, it's almost like the industry was allowed this massive amount of leeway simply because there was no public pressure on regulators and legislators. As you see, you know, only half of us even believed it was happening here. So our very first challenge in the campaign was to simply alerting Aussies that shark finning wasn't just an ocean conservation issue from far-flung third world countries, but rather that this was happening in our own backyard. So what exactly does our trade look like? Next slide.
Okay, so there's a lot of data on this page. It can be a little bit confusing. I've worked in this kind of analysis for the best part of a decade and it still confuses me. So the main points we want to take away from this is that none of the data that's available from various different sources, the FAO, government departments, and customs, they don't match each other. And the importing records from other countries, what they're receiving from Australia is much higher than what Australia is reporting as exporting. And the same for imports. What other countries report that they are exporting to Australia is far in excess of what Australia is reporting that we are receiving. And this is most likely because Australia has chosen not to adopt the new HS codes. We're still using our country-specific HS codes for shark fin. And this is making lining up trade records across countries and across different data sources very difficult. On the importing data here, the FAO value, which is this big spike here, that's actually against the different scale on the right here. That's showing that an average from between 2007 to 2014, we imported on average 440 tons of shark fin per year. So that's showing that there's actually a significant market for shark fin in Australia. And on the right here, this is our exports. And from 2015 onwards, we're reporting just about no exports. So we don't think this is accurate because there's a number of countries that were significant trading partners, such as Hong Kong, that are also not using the HS codes, and that's what most of that blue there is. That's all Hong Kong. But say that data is correct, and we're not exporting any of the shark fins that we're catching, we are still a significant, as Larry said, we're a significant country in terms of landing and catching sharks. So if those shark fins are staying within Australia and it's a domestic use, then that's a significant market within Australia. And we should be able to ensure that the sharks being caught in our country and in our waters are being caught with their fins naturally attached. And we'll go into details soon as to the loopholes that are in our legislation that could mean that there's sharks fin entering our trade that hasn't come from fisheries with fins naturally attached. And that's the issue.
Just a quick question, Karen. And I'm sure many people probably aren't. I mean, we're familiar with it, but are you able to explain what a HS code is or what HS stands for? Because I'm sure there are people.
Yeah. Sorry, I did skip over that a bit. It's just it's harmonized system code. It's basically just an acronym that is short for a customs code. It's meant to mean that all the countries in the world are using a harmonized system so that we're all using the same HS codes. But as we've discussed, many countries have their own specific HS codes that are not used by other countries, which Australia is one. And therefore, it's not really as harmonized as it should be.
So just, I suppose, a simple example, if I was exporting this lovely mug to you and my HS code was 1234, you might import it and record that very same cup as 5678.
Correct.
And therein lies the discrepancy.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Awesome. Thanks for that. So yeah, very confusing. And I think Larry's going to sort of actually help tease apart this data and let's have a look at what it means in terms of individual sharks. And there we go.
Yeah, right. So how many sharks are we talking? Due to difficulties, discrepancies, inconsistencies that Karen just covered, it's difficult to say. But our best estimates come from using an average range of the weight of an individual shark. So we get these kinds of numbers. So a max of 60K per year imported and about 50,000 per year exported. And that little photo, so conveniently included by Leo, is to picture half the MCG. So is 50,000. So quite a bit. You know, that's a lot of Australian sharks that are getting exported each and every year. And you know, moving right along. So Leo, my man, Dr. Guida, what are the issues of shark fishing facing here in Oz? What's your diagnosis?
All right. So let's all have a look at some issues in our backyard. So bear with me. Right. So going back to the good old UN FAO stats of where we're at globally. As Karen touched on, there's a significant market for sharks in Australia, where in fact, at least according to statistics from 2000 to 2011, which from the FAO is the most recent available data that we've got, we're in the top 20 importers of the world. And from memory, we're sitting at about number 17. So there is a significant market for imported shark fins here. And what that means, and this goes to speak to what Karen said about trade codes and things not matching up and not being sure of what fishery it comes from, let alone what particular fishery has certain things in place. It's very likely that we're supporting illegal and unsustainable fisheries. It's quite a distinct possibility. And that speaks to, again, matching these codes, knowing where something comes from, and also knowing what species. So that's issue number one. The other really, really big issue that we have here in Australia that most people probably aren't aware of, and as Larry touched on, half the people aren't even aware that we trade in fins, is our weak and inconsistent anti-finning laws. Now remember, finning is cutting the fins off a shark and dumping the body. This is illegal in all Australian waters. However, when we look a bit deeper, the rules are still weak and, as I touched on, inconsistent around the country. And we're behind what's best practice. And Karen mentioned this earlier, and that is what's called fins naturally attached. basically means that when you catch a shark and you land it, i.e. bring it to the boat and take it back to port for processing, is that it has its fins still on. And by doing this, it's a practical measure of stopping finning from happening. And it also has some other benefits like being able to identify the shark species accurately. So I'll show this video now, which explains fins naturally attached and the issue in Australia quite nicely. And then I'll speak to some progress that we have made.
Is this meant to have sound, Leo?
Yes, it is. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a technical glitch and I wasn't able to get it happening. But for anyone who did want to watch that again, that video is on AMCS's Facebook page. It's also on the Shark Champions website as well. So if you visit sharkchampions.org.au and you have a look at issues finning, you can watch that video back with sound. So apologies for the lack of sound on that one there, everyone. But as you saw, there are jurisdictions in Australia that didn't have fins naturally attached, and what that meant for not just the illegal practice of finning, but also being able to detect endangered species entering the trade. Sorry, one moment. So a bit of an update on that video. So that video was from 2019 from memory. Fortunately enough, we have made some progress since then, and this is largely thanks to the public support. So big round of applause to everyone. We have made some significant progress. And by that, I mean that in December 2018, the Northern Territory implemented a fins naturally attached policy in its major shark fishery, the offshore net and line fishery. Unfortunately, it's still absent in some of their other fisheries that legally harvest sharks. But I suppose the silver lining to that is the amount of sharks caught in those fisheries is minimal relative to its main shark fishery. In Queensland, again, massive win in 2020, the east coast of Queensland. So this is where the Great Barrier Reef is. Commercial fishing still happens in the Great Barrier Reef with nets to catch sharks for their meat and fins, particularly the endangered Scalloped Hammerhead. And the great news was that in 2020, Queensland put in place fins naturally attached for its east coast fishery. Unfortunately, in the Gulf of Carpentaria, so that's this little pocket up here in the north, that fishery in Queensland still doesn't have it, but we're currently in the process of working hard for that. The glaring, absolutely glaring, I suppose, issue here is Western Australia. Western Australia is the only jurisdiction in Australia that does not have fins naturally attached. Should also mention that it also has the second largest dedicated shark fishery in the country by volume. So you're looking at a fishery, if you can see my little dot on the screen, you're looking at a fishery that spans from this part here in WA right along the south to the South Australian border. So there is an opportunity right now to get fins naturally attached in this fishery because it's currently under review, and I'll explain that down the track. But the take-home message here is that our anti-finning laws are weak and inconsistent. They're weak because we're still yet to have it fully implemented in Queensland and Northern Territory, and they're inconsistent because, well, as you can see, Northern Territory is the glaring omission here. So it's not the same standard across the country, and we have the standard in place. Again, drilling down a bit deeper, there's a bit of a case study, if we want to call it this, and this is with the case of hammerhead. So we recently looked at the trade of, or the management, Australia's management of hammerhead sharks in Australia. So how much were being caught, where they were being caught, the measures in place to protect them, and also their trade volumes. And what we found out through looking through this is that in 2017, for example, there was 900 kilograms of great hammerhead, if I'm not mistaken, great hammerhead shark fins that arrived in China that were recorded as being imported from Australia. But looking at the Australian records, there's no corresponding export record. It was almost as if, at least on paper anyway, it never happened. Now, at best, this suggests, as Karen hinted at earlier, some pretty dodgy accounting and some pretty inadequate means of tracking what's actually happening on our water and our trade. At worst, illegal trade or finning, who knows? So either way you look at it, it needs to be fixed, particularly when you're dealing with an endangered species like hammerhead sharks. So given that hammerheads are globally, scalloped hammerheads are globally recognised as critically endangered, or at the very least endangered in Australian waters, without getting into the weeds too much, fins naturally attached was recommended as part of its management in Australia as a means to aid the conservation of this species and better control how much is being fished and support the recovery of this animal. It was recommended that fins naturally attached be put in across the board, everywhere, no exceptions. As we saw in the previous slide, still hasn't been done. And this report was done way back in, these recommendations were put in place way back in 2014. And as part of those recommendations, were the fins not naturally attached recommendation not met, Australia's independent body of scientists that make recommendations for threatened species basically said, if it's not met in place, then it should be listed as endangered and treated as a fully protected species under national environmental law. So we haven't met these recommendations. We're still trading in endangered animals, and we've got dodgy records. It just doesn't add up, to put it bluntly. And as you can see there on the slide, we still continue to trade in an endangered animal and not meet not just Australian expectations, but international expectations for when you're trading globally in a species. The next thing we're going to touch on is, I suppose, the million-dollar question. And that is, well, shouldn't we just ban the fin trade altogether? Don't import, don't export, just don't trade fins at all. It's filled with a lot of moral, philosophical, and also practical points of view. And this question in itself, you could probably dedicate an entire PhD or a university course to. So what we're going to focus on here for the next few minutes is what the leading science says and the practical solutions that offer the most immediate benefits when we start looking at on-the-water effects and the conservation of threatened shark species across the world and within Australia. So, funnily enough, if we went for a complete ban on the shark fin trade, it could have some perverse outcomes that we might not necessarily be aware of or expect. So first, let's say we go, all right, well, let's just ban the imports of shark fins. So at least we know that within our fisheries, at least we know that what we're doing is fine and we're not supporting unsustainable fisheries or illegal practices overseas. Well, great in theory, but it's a bit hypocritical when we don't have fins naturally attached across the board in Australia. So that counts that out. The second option we can look at is a complete trade ban. Now, a complete trade ban right now. There's a problem because sure, you might be able to ban the trade in fins, but we're ultimately still selling the meat of sharks. So some might say, well, if we're catching sharks for their meat, and these fisheries are somewhat reasonably managed, not necessarily sustainable, but reasonably managed, well, then why wouldn't we trade the fins too? I mean, the sharks are already there, we're already using the meat. Do we just throw the fins in the bin? So that's one problem. There's wastage in that respect. You then might argue, well, okay, well, how about we just ban shark fishing altogether? So this issue of even using the meat, it's not happening. We're not fishing for sharks at all. There's another problem with this. Because Australia's waters are so biodiverse and all our fisheries are multi-species fisheries, so there's a lot of fish and a lot of different animals that get caught as bycatch in our fisheries, sharks are inevitably going to get caught. and they're inevitably going to be killed as bycatch and thrown back dead if this was the case. This, I suppose, at its most superficial level, is just wastage, where fishing sharks, the ones that end up dead, are being thrown back dead. That's not necessarily great either. So you then might think, all right, well, let's still go with the ban on catching sharks altogether, but let's close the fishery once X amount of sharks or rays have been killed. Let's put a cap on it. There's another problem with this. If we completely ban the take of sharks, or if we completely ban shark fishing altogether, there's little or no incentive for fishers to actually record the species that they're catching and in the numbers that they're catching them in. A lot of the information that we get today comes from commercial catch records. So there's going to be no incentive to record any of the sharks they catch and the ones that they throw back dead. So how are we going to know when a cap is being reached if we don't have accurate records of what's actually being caught? The good news is, though, is that you are getting warmer when you start thinking about caps or quotas on how many die. So this is where fins naturally attached presents a really elegant solution to this massive problem. For one, when sharks are landed and they have their fins naturally attached, as the video highlighted, we can tell what species they are. Sharks are very hard to identify once you remove their fins. They're a main identifying feature. So by being able to better ID sharks, no endangered species are going to enter the trade because we'll know if an endangered shark gets caught illegally and put in there. But also more importantly is we'll know what species are being caught and how many are being caught. And with this data, we can then start putting these caps or these quotas on specific species so that once a limit is reached and it's no longer sustainable for that species to handle any more fishing pressure, we can then talk about how we close that fishery for that particular period of time and ease that pressure and give these sharks and rays room to recover. The next thing is again, full utilization. We're not wasting any part of the animal. So if it is caught and it is used for meat, we can use the fins. It's been naturally attached and we're not wasting any part of the animal. And this, I should also mention that this comes hand in hand with being able to monitor the population very closely, which goes to speak to the first point. The other aspect is that fisheries with fins naturally attached can be certified as such. So we know where it's coming from overseas, because we're going to be importing sharks that have their fins naturally attached. And in theory, you could charge a premium price for this. Now, by charging a premium price for this, in theory, the money can then be better invested into sustainable fisheries management as a resource. And overall, be used to continually improve environmental sustainability of that fishery. But here's the real kicker. The beautiful thing about having fins naturally attached on a shark, if you either want to import it or if you want to export it, is do you actually really want to trade fins? Because this fins naturally attached on all exports and imports actually disincentivizes the trade because it's going to become really expensive for you to do so. You got to remember, you're now having to ship effectively the whole animal. That comes with space restrictions and weight restrictions, and you're going to have to pay for it. And then you have to charge a fortune to make a profit. So do you really want to do it? And that's a really practical way or a de facto ban on the fin trade itself. And this is something that Canada's done and what the UK has done. So it'll be great to see how that evolves there and what we can learn from that too. I suppose really the most important thing is with fins naturally attached is it's immediately actionable. We can do this right now. Aside from looking at the perverse outcomes of possible perverse outcomes from a complete trade ban, when we start looking at the laws with regards to that, it can take a lot of time just to change these laws with respect to how Australia internationally trades. And this is simply time. This is simply time. We're talking multiple years that some of these species may not necessarily have, given the threats that they face with extinction. So fins naturally attached is an immediate action. It's a practical way to really stem the trade in fins. And again, it feeds back into better data collection, better traceability, and ultimately better decision-making on how we can protect sharks in our waters. And so the big thing is you're probably asking, well, what can you do right now? There's a QR code on your screen. Whip out your phones. Everyone's familiar with the QR code now, given the world that we live in with contact tracing. That'll take you straight to a petition. That petition will go to the Federal Environment Minister, and that'll ask her to put rules in place for the Western Australian shark fishery that's currently under review to have fins naturally attached. It's a really important mechanism that we use to get rules in place. It's the exact same mechanism that we used and support to get it in place in Queensland, and we can do it again in WA. The great thing is if you do it now and we apply pressure now and we tell the Environment Minister, look, this is something that Australia needs. It's a gold standard. We can get there. The great thing is we can expect a decision possibly as early as September, but we hope that by the end of this year, Western Australia will be able to say we will have fins naturally attached in our fisheries, and we'll be able to say that in every jurisdiction in Australia, fins naturally attached is in place, and we will have made significant progress to strengthening our anti-finning laws and making them consistent across the country. As we touched on earlier, there are still some gaps in Queensland and Northern Territory. We're working on these very hard right now, but do stay tuned for any progress on that because we will need your help in the very near future. But right now, WA is our focus. We have the chance right now for WA. So on that note, I'd like to thank everyone. I'll just stop sharing the presentation. There we go. On that note, I'd like to thank everyone for listening to the talk. And we're now going to open up the floor for some questions. So if you haven't already written some questions, listen to some questions being asked, take some time to digest all the information that's being presented. And again, if we don't get to answer your questions right now, we will make our very best effort to address them in the comments in the few days to a week and so forth to come. So to start with, and there's a lot of questions here. So okay, we might just touch back on it because some people might have missed it. But Karen, do you mind again just briefly going over what a HS code is and what that means for traceability? Sorry, Karen, you're on mute.
Sorry, I had to mute. My dogs were starting to go a bit mental. Yeah, so HS codes are a harmonized systems code. It's put out by the World Customs Organization. They go through iterations. It's a book about this big of every product you can think of. Timber, furniture, shoes, everything has a unique code that exporters and importers put on their permits to notify to customs what it is that's in the shipment. And I won't get into the fraud parts of it, but there's a lot of inconsistencies. So there's it's quite complicated. So most of them have a 6-digit HS code. That underneath that, you'll then have 8-digit HS codes, which are country specific. So if you're using an 8-digit HS code, it should roll up to one that's easily identifiable. So that's why the dried shark fin was easy to trace, because that was a 6 HS code that any country underneath it would just have the 6 numbers and then say 001 or 002. Each country would have a different one. The problem now is that some countries are using 8-digit HS codes that don't roll up to the 6-digit HS code that is now being implemented across the world. So it means if you're looking at the trade data, it's really hard to tell, tease the information apart. If it's underneath a 6-digit HS code for fish, but it's a shark fin or a shark tail or some other part of the shark, you can't tell if you only have access to the 6-digit data. Most of the data is reported at the 6-digit level. Otherwise, then that's what took so long with this report, because I actually went to the 8-digit and down for a lot of the main traders. So Hong Kong, China, about 10 or 15 of the top traders, I went down to their 8 to 10-digit levels to get all of the trade data. Yeah, it's probably still an underestimate because there's a lot of countries that are still using different HS codes that I didn't include in that data. So that's a conservative estimate.
Okay, we've got some other great questions. So,
sorry.
No, you're right. I'll pass this one on to Larry. So Larry, this is from Malcolm Poole. What are the main shark fin species for Australian-based species? So basically, what species are we catching and trading fins in?
Great question, Malcolm. Thank you very much. Yeah, Leo, I probably need a little bit of assistance with this one, but as far as I'm aware, hammerhead shark are hard hit on the East Coast for sure. And there's some also the most highly valued fins. So I know those are especially prized. And when you get into issues like grading, which I don't think we quite touched on, but that's claiming one shark's fins belongs to a different shark so you can keep a smaller body on board and rah and all that. A lot of times that issue comes on with hammerhead sharks because those fins are so valuable. Some of the other top traded species, and chime in, guys, if you've got some as well. I know a lot of the dogfish down south and school shark are regularly taken, and I'm sure those fins are sent off as well. If you guys know of any other that are up near the top?
Well, that's the problem with the data as well. It's not species specific. So you can't, the only way you can tell is through different surveys that they've done in the shark fin markets where they've done DNA testing. So oceanic whitetip is one that is caught. It's not that we don't have very many records in our fisheries data of catching oceanic whitetips, maybe 10 a year, something like that. Paw beagle is another one that is occasionally caught and its fins are sold. Yeah, pretty much any shark species that's in our waters that gets caught, its fins will be sent off. Tiger sharks as well. Yeah.
And again, as you said, Karen, this goes to speak to why fins naturally attached is so important, because then we can get a better idea of, as what Malcolm's asking, what species are being caught and in what volumes for their fins.
Yeah. Well, it's complicated in Australia as well because a lot of our market is actually for the meat. The fins are a byproduct in Australia specifically. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Great. Thanks for that question, Malcolm. I'll shoot this one over to Leo. Leo, why is it taking WA so long to implement the FNA policy?
That's a great question. I genuinely don't know what's taken them so long. But what we do know is that, and again, this webinar is evident of it, is that there is increased growing public concern, and people, if they haven't already, are going to start asking, why Western Australia are you the only ones left? What's the issue here? What's going on? If everyone else is stepping up to world's best practice in terms of not just the conservation of sharks, but even just general sustainability in fisheries management, why aren't you guys doing it? You are the second largest shark fishery in Australia, dedicated shark fishery by volume. I think there was another question in here saying, well, which is the largest? The largest is the southern and eastern scalefish and shark fishery. Now, this is the largest.
Otherwise known as the SESIF.
The SESIF, and this is the largest fishery in Australia, but also the largest shark fishery in Australia. And this one spans from the South Australian WA border right through, wraps around up to about mid-coast New South Wales, and that includes Victoria, Tasmania. That's
a Commonwealth fishery as well, so
yeah.
A state fishery, right?
Yeah. So that fishery there is managed by the federal government, and it butts right up against the West Australian fishery, which is managed by the state government in Western Australia. And that Commonwealth fishery has had FNA for quite some time now. So it's strange that a fishery that operates largely quite similarly, it catches the same kind of species in the same kind of environment, that is temperate Australia, uses the same kind of fishing gear, so whether it's nets or long lines, yet in Western Australia, there's no fins naturally attached. So in essence, there's no real excuse why they can't have it or why they don't have it. But again, I encourage everyone to sign that action, to ask Western Australia to put it in place. And the good news is that I am cautiously optimistic that they will do it. There have been some very positive conversations, but at the same time, they're just conversations. We really need to get this decision in stone, and this will come down to the Australian public supporting that as well. Okay, I will.
So there's a question here, Leo, that is directed at AMCS. Is another one from Malcolm. Does AMCS support legitimate fins attached to import and exported sharks?
So I'm asking, so if I understand, Malcolm's asking, does AMCS believe that there should be fins actually attached for all imports and exports, correct? That's how I would interpret it?
I think that's how he means it, yes.
Yeah, well, again, in the report that we commissioned that you wrote, Karen, and you made the expert recommendation, and it does follow world's best science, and that is that Australia, at a bare minimum, should be asking for all imports and exports of sharks to come with fins naturally attached.
We didn't say exports, we only said imports. Because in Australia, we use most of the meat, so we don't export too much meat.
Okay.
Yeah, so we didn't say that in the report.
Okay, no worries. But the point being is that we do believe that fins naturally attached should be a bare minimum practice for the reasons that we touched on earlier about species identifications and also disincentivizing trade in the first place because of the expense associated with it. Okay, we've got quite a lot of interesting questions. It's difficult to choose which one. Forgive me, everyone, for taking my time. Larry, this is from Jake Watson. Is there education to reduce the demands for fins? And I suppose another question associated with that could also be, what could people do to increase awareness about the demand for fins or the fin trade in general?
Yes, great question. Thank you so much. As Karen kind of touched on, and our report goes into a little bit, there has been a reduction in demand in China. There's a lot of social movement. I think the NBA player Yao Ming was on a big promotional campaign to reduce the demand for shark fin soup in China. I know a lot of Chinese hotel chains and restaurants and airlines have since banned shark fin soup from being served under their auspices. But as you can see, like, it's still going on. When I talk to some Chinese mates, they tell me that it's still very much a status symbol. It's still very much, it's not really about the taste, it's about the price. And if you can provide your guest at your daughter's wedding with a buffet, with a shark fin soup, a bowl for everyone, then that's high status. That's like driving around a very nice car. So the demand is still there, but there has been headway made. Now, as far as in other parts of the world, I mean, yeah, exactly. We kind of need the same. We kind of need the same attitude and the same kind of progress and effort everywhere else, because as we know, Australia is importing shark product as well, and some of that is fins. So we do have a ways to go. And what can we do about it? Yeah, share what you know about it. As we saw, as we talked about earlier, only half of Australians even know that this is going on in our country. So talking to your friends and your family about it, just getting that awareness out. I mean, and I know that's a simple, easy first step. It doesn't feel like you're making a big difference, but if everyone goes home and talks to their family or their friends about this a little bit, it's actually quite a few people. And furthermore, sign these petitions. They actually do work. These politicians will look at the numbers behind a petition. So that QR code that we put up at the end of this, join Shark Champions. You'll get updates on all kinds of stuff. We're constantly working on these finning and shark fishing sustainability campaigns, and that's the best that we can do in the country right now. Like we said, we chose fins naturally attached as the way forward because it's immediately actionable. This is something that we feel like we can win in the very near future, but it's key that we have your help to do that. And that's definitely something every one of you can do today to help us with this. Ooh, and I will choose a question for the next person. Let's see. Ooh, let's see. Bear with me, guys.
Not choosing your favorite child. There's a million.
All right. Well, we touched on this one a little bit about shark meat imports into Australia. Daz has asked, what about fish and chip shops selling flake? Does that have something to do? Is that related to this? And what can we do about that? I think I'll throw that one to Leo.
Yeah. Okay. So how to answer this question, because they are in some respects different issues, but still related, and each have their own sort of problems. So it speaks to, largely it speaks to species identification and dealing with the issue on the water at the start. So yes, you can get into labeling laws, and yes, there's no legal obligation to call a shark meat by its species once it's in the shop and it's sold to you. That is a very important thing to resolve, but it doesn't address the root cause, and that is, how do we stop endangered species entering trade in the first place? And also, how do we stop endangered species entering trade in the first place? And how do we limit the amount of endangered species that are killed from fishing, quite frankly? And so how that's related to fins naturally attached is, again, it speaks to this issue where if you've got the fins naturally attached on a shark, when the records are made by the fishers as to what species they catch and in what volumes, it's far easier for compliance officers to cross-check those records more accurately and go, yep, I can clearly see that, judging, because the fins are attached, yep, that's clearly 10 scalloped hammerhead sharks, that's clearly 300 gummy sharks, that's clearly 20 dusky sharks, X, Y, and Z. The flip side is that without fins naturally attached, you've literally got a pile of fins and a pile of flesh. And you look at that, and because they only have to be in a weight ratio, which is about 5% weight ratio, it's very, very difficult to go, well, we know that there's, according to these records, it only says, there's 20 scalloped hammerheads. But how do I know there's 20 if I've only got a pile of fins to look at and a pile of flesh to look at? And that's putting it in simple terms. So to go back to the whole flake argument or shark meat argument, is that with fins naturally attached, we know what species we're catching in what volumes, means better data is being recorded, which ultimately means that the appropriate controls can be put in place on fisheries to limit the impact they have on endangered and threatened species. Because without the fins naturally attached, that compliance issue is very confusing, and it's very difficult to determine exactly how many of the threatened or endangered species end up on our plate. So that's, I suppose, the best way I can describe a very complex answer. If it still is confusing, by all means, please drop an additional comment in response to that on your comment, Daz, and we'll talk through it. So thank you. Okay. We've got Michelle Tang, who's asked, we've mentioned scalloped hammerheads a few times, and Larry, this is probably a good one for you. Michelle Tang has asked, you mentioned that hammerheads are a highly targeted species, or at the very least, if they're not highly targeted, they are caught in considerable numbers. Is there any chance this is closely related to the conservation-dependent loophole? So I suppose, if I understand that correctly, Michelle, I think Michelle's asking, how does fins naturally attached work with the conservation-dependent loophole and the fact that we still fish them? And for those who aren't aware, what does conservation dependency mean? So I know it's quite a complex question, but Larry, if you're able to walk us through that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I'd love to. That's a great question. So that's another thing that Leo and I work very closely with the federal government and the Federal Department of the Environment on is Ebbc listings. So the Ebbc Act is the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. It's the main piece of legislation for environmental protection and conservation in Australia. And you can nominate species that are endangered or threatened to be listed. And if a species is listed, it cannot, well, in most cases, it cannot be commercially exploited. However, there's a small little bit of a legislative loophole called conservation dependent, which Michelle quite rightly is bringing up. So if an animal, and it's only been for marine fish, so sharks or fish, if an animal qualifies for a higher threat level, say vulnerable or endangered, but industry still finds it important to be commercially utilized, or there's still some value in harvesting that animal, they'll put it under another category called conservation dependent. So it's kind of a way from the government's point of view to keep a close watch on these species while it's still being utilized. From an NGO's point of view, from environmental and animal welfare point of view, it's kind of like, look, we should be protecting this animal a lot better, but a lot of jobs are involved, a lot of money's involved, and we don't really want to do as good as we can for this animal. And it's a really actually disappointing outcome when an animal gets listed as conservation dependent.
It's problematic too, because conservation dependent is not a matter of national environmental significance. So if a shark is listed as conservation dependent, it's not considered in any development approval. So if you have a new port or a new dredging activity that's going to completely wipe out a pupping area for a critically endangered, say, school shark or hammerhead, it can't be considered within the development approval. So it's, when they thought of conservation dependent, they were really only thinking of it from a fisheries context and not all of the other contexts that this species could be impacted.
So yes, thank you very much, Karen. And that's how we get species like the globally IUCN red listed critically endangered scalloped hammerhead as not considered endangered in Australia, but rather conservation dependent. So that is one of the species that is frequently taken in the fin trade. That's mostly a tropical species.
There's good news there, though. It is going up to the TSSC again. It's been recommended for endangered listing again. It's on the FPAL at the moment, and the assessment should be finished in April next year.
Yes, indeed it has. Thank you. So yes, so as it sits right now, the scalloped hammerhead can still be harvested, still be utilized in the fin trade, despite qualifying for an endangered listing. But like Karen mentioned, watch this space because hopefully that's going to change soon.
I think Michelle also, and you might have mentioned it, wanted to know how conservation dependent related to fins naturally attached specifically. And I was wondering if you could perhaps explain, as part of it being conservation dependent, fins naturally attached had to be in place, or how would that work? Or how is that meant to work for it to qualify as conservation dependent?
So that's right. Yeah, thanks, Leo. When it was listed as conservation dependent, there were certain rules and regulations that had to be put in place. You know, the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, the group of researchers and shark, or well, depending on what animal or plant is being up for assessment, there's a group of experts that decide whether or not that happens. And when the group of shark experts and fisheries experts decided to list scalloped hammerhead as conservation dependent, there was a list of rules and regulations that needed to be implemented. And that was years ago now, and those rules and regulations still have not been implemented. One of them was a fins naturally attached regulation for those fisheries. And as we said, that still hasn't been completely done. And that's really the kind of updates that we're pushing for, and that we're really pressuring the Federal Department of the Environment to really look into and clean up their act on.
Cool. I've just noticed the time, and we've got time for one more question. And I might put this one to Karen because it has to deal with exports. And the question is, I just lost it now. Sorry, bear with me. Great. Sorry, I lost it, but I do remember the gist of the question. And forgive me if I don't remember whose name it was, but the gist of the question was if Australia is exporting fins, does this include any foreign fisheries or foreign operating in Australian waters? Do they get, I suppose, counted in our exports, or how?
No. So foreign fishing vessels that are fishing illegally in our waters would not be, because they're not landing the sharks in Australia and then exporting it from Australia. So yes, as far as I'm aware, we don't have I haven't been involved in too much in fisheries since I left the department, but back then I don't think we had too many foreign fishing vessels that were legally allowed to fish within our waters. Back in the 90s, that was a thing, but I don't think it is anymore. So no, only illegal fisheries that are landed within Australia would be counted within that import and export data.
Cool. Thanks for that. And again, thank you everyone for all your questions. There is literally, there's literally 20 odd questions that we got fed just in the past 20 odd minutes. And there's plenty more that we'd love to answer. So again, we apologize if we weren't able to answer them during this webinar. We will get to them, so bear with us. And as a final, I suppose, take-home message is, as Larry touched on earlier, fins naturally attached is the most immediate thing, an actionable thing we can do to improve the conservation and recovery of threatened shark species in Australia. And it's also not just benefiting sharks and rays, but just benefiting how our fisheries fish from an environmental sustainability perspective. It really is world's best practice. It's a fundamental practice, and it should be in all our fisheries as well. So make sure you do check out that QR code, or have a look in the comments for how to sign the petition to get fins naturally attached in WA. And on behalf of everyone at AMCS, thank you very much for attending, and we'll keep you posted in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much. See ya.
Yeah.